Okay, I'm going to go ahead and get started here. My name is Daniel Bennett, and I'm a research professor with the Baugh Center for Entrepreneurship and Free Enterprise. Free Enterprise Center was established in 2013 through the generous donations of numerous donors. The goal of the center is to become a national leader in promoting the role of free enterprise for entrepreneurship and human flourishing. It seeks to do so through research, teaching, and informing public policy. The Free Enterprise Forum is one of our main programs for outreach, and the forum features distinguished lectures by global thought leaders on topics related to public policy, free enterprise, entrepreneurship, and innovation. So if you're interested in staying up to date on what we're doing, you can sign up for our mailing list. There'll be some clipboards circulating. I want to thank the Department of Economics for co-sponsoring this event. Today's guest is Dr. David Audretsch, Distinguished Professor and the Emeritech Chair of Development at Indiana University, where he also directs the Institute for Development Strategies. His work focuses on the links between entrepreneurship, government policy, innovation, and economic development. He's one of the world's leading entrepreneurship scholars. He's received awards from the Swedish Entrepreneurship Forum, as well as the Schumpeter Prize from the University of Wuppertal in Germany. He's published hundreds of peer-reviewed journal articles in some of the leading business and economics journals. He's also authored or edited more than 50 books, including Everything in Its Place, Entrepreneurship and the Strategic Management of Cities, Regions, and States, which is available in the hallway for purchase at a discounted rate. So if you're interested in his ideas, please pick up a copy, and I'm sure he'd be glad to sign it afterwards if you're a autograph seeker like I am. He's also co-founder and editor-in-chief of the journal Small Business Economics, which is one of the top entrepreneurship field journals. And he, as of today, I checked, has received more than 85,000 citations on his scholarly work, which is unfathomable as a scholar. So please join me in welcoming Dr. Audretsch.
Thanks very much for that very kind, generous, warm introduction. Thanks also for the invitation to come down to Waco. It's my first trip here, and beautiful, beautiful town, beautiful campus. The weather certainly doesn't hurt. It's a great, beautiful spring day here. Up north in Indiana, it's snowing and cold and frigid, and down here, you know, it's warm, it's green. You have a basketball team that went to the NCAA tournament. Things are just not so good further up north. I really appreciate coming. I've had a great time here, and in fact, we'll continue throughout the rest of the visit. Entrepreneurship and economic growth. Most of you probably know Europe's going through a crisis right now. Got Brexit, got political movements spurring to the extremes, to the left, to the right. It's not the first crisis Europe has had. About the turn of the century, Europe was bogged down, economic stagnation, meaning it wasn't growing. Many of the countries were actually declining in terms of GDP per capita. Unemployment was ratcheting higher and higher and higher. A lot of countries had double-digit unemployment. And about the turn of the century, I know some of you students, were you born the turn of the century? Barely. Well, that's good. I can't say that too much longer. But the president of the European Union, Romano Prodi, an economist, actually, a PhD economist, he had been and went back to being a professor at the University of Bologna, but was president of the European Union. When he looked at the state of Europe, he realized what Europe needs to move ahead is entrepreneurship. And he made in a famous pronouncement, he said, our lacuna, which means our lack, our paucity in the field of entrepreneurship needs to be taken seriously because there is mounting evidence that the key to economic growth and productivity improvements lies in the entrepreneurial capacity of an economy. Now, I was really happy to hear him say that because somehow I had been it gravitated towards doing research in entrepreneurship. You know, Baylor has one of the most important departments, programs in entrepreneurship, not just in the United States, but in the world. But I suppose back then, it was still a pretty new field and just getting off. So it was quite striking that the president of the U, it wasn't really just him though, actually, policymakers, thought leaders, not just throughout Europe, but in this side of the Atlantic, in Washington, if you looked at way back then, if you looked at Clinton, and then President Bush, then President Obama, all of them emphasized that the key to igniting growth is entrepreneurship. And I guess I found that startling because when I was in your seats as the students, both the undergraduates, but then certainly the graduate students, the masters, and I can see we have a couple PhD students here. Oh, forget to turn on. Professors, let's see. Is that better? No. That's better. Professors are bad at following instructions. Should I start from the beginning again? No, you heard that. No. That's better. But the focus on entrepreneurship as a driver of growth was surprising to me because when I was in your seats, both as an undergraduate, but then as a graduate student, either as a master's or PhD student, I never heard about entrepreneurship at all as being important for growth. What I heard was this famous equation, and if you don't follow the math or the equation, don't worry about it. It won the author, Robert Solow, the Nobel Prize, which is to identify why do some places grow more than others? Why does the developed countries grow more than perhaps some of the less developed countries, say of Africa and South America? And Solow came up with a model that said, the Q is the growth. And he said it depends on two things. Don't pay any attention to those Greek letters. It's all Greek to me. But he said it's really the K and the L. And the K is capital, which refers to factories and machines, equipment. Really, the concept goes all the way back to, why do they use K, because not C? Because Karl Marx's famous book, if you think, what was it called? Das Kapital. And somehow that traditional folk, even way back to Marx, what made a difference for driving the standard of living prosperity? If you had factories and machines, like the richest cities, when I was in your seats, when I was a student, undergrad, certainly in high school, the richest city in this country was Detroit. I know that shocks young people, even some of the people who might be assistant for Detroit. How could they? Well, Detroit had the great auto factories. Pittsburgh had the great steel factories. Akron, Ohio had the great tires. The Midwest had that physical capital. Of course, you need more than machines. You need people to work in the factories, and that's what the L was. The Greek letters are just kind of, you can think of them as ornaments. And I noticed when coming into town from Dallas yesterday, and I went by that General Motors plant and thought, oh yeah, that K is not just in Detroit anymore, right? It's kind of moved down. And but Solow won the Nobel Prize for saying this is why some places are rich. It's also why some companies thrive and the others don't. Why are some workers have higher wages than other workers? They get to work with the K. If you can't work with K, you really go into impoverished regions, Appalachia, impoverished countries with very little capital, physical capital, without these factories and machines. They're the L. They may not be any less motivated, they may not be any less hardworking, they may not be any less deserving people, but their wages are lower, not because of the L, but because of the K. And this really described or characterized, I think, the way the economy was back in what now is called the second industrial era. We're on the cusp of the fourth industrial era, which for you young people, this is your generation. The fourth industrial era, of course, is the advent of artificial intelligence, AI, and machine learning. And the first industrial era, which went back to Fulton and the steam engine, that all started in Manchester and Birmingham, England, centuries ago. That lasted until after the Civil War. The second industrial era was really mass production, factory. That was the era of K. And that started in this country after the Civil War, maybe 1870s, and lasted until the end of the 1960s, at which point there was a shift to, you could call it, or people call it the computational era. So there's been 4 industrial eras. And what strikes me is, well, of course, we're in the 4th industrial era now. And the 3rd industrial era, 1969, I was in high school getting ready for college. The 2nd industrial era was pretty much my childhood. So I've experienced 3 industrial eras of the 4, and I think, oh, maybe if I were just a little bit older, I could have experienced all 4 industrial eras. But things changed. And when that 3rd industrial era came, let's try this. There was a shift from factories and machines to ideas. Why was that? Partly is because of the advent of globalization. We didn't stop using cars and steel and so on, but it was cheaper to outsource, offshore them to other locations. That was great for the developing world. Not so great for Detroit or Pittsburgh or Gary, Indiana, up where I live. And so places that were focused on the solo model, the physical capital, tended to suffer. We saw places that were focused on ideas and knowledge. Now the R there is reflects research and development, or what Paul Romer, who just won the Nobel Prize, characterizes as knowledge, ideas. And this seemed to be the driving force in what mattered. The thing about the shift from the 2nd to the 3rd industrial era, whether it was really 69 or 1970, I was around then. Nobody knew it. I mean, nobody knew there was a change. We just knew the bottom had fallen out in Detroit, in Pittsburgh, in Buffalo, these old industrial, not just in this country. If you went to the UK, it was in Birmingham, Manchester. If you went to Germany, it was in the Ruhr Valley. Every place that was based on physical capital in the developed world started to face this crisis, because now it's clear it was globalization, outsourcing, offshoring. But then as this knowledge came on, places that were based on ideas were doing great. So what Paul Romer realized and characterized pretty early on in the 1980s in his models of economic growth is that what's driving prosperity and growth, people with places that have good jobs, sustainable jobs, is they're based on ideas. Where ideas come from, sure, it's research and development. It's exactly what you're doing here, accumulating human capital, which is you learn how to think with ideas, and then you go out in the world. And I remember it was a little bit later. It was during this crisis in Europe, towards the late 90s. Europe was bogged down, as I said, stagnant growth, unemployment ratcheting up. And there was a little meeting in Stockholm. The Ministry of Economics called a meeting to kind of brainstorm some thought leaders of what can Sweden do to get out of this slump, to get out of this stagnation. And I was armed with this new model, this kind of Romer growth model that said, no, it's not factories, it's knowledge and ideas, it's research and development. So I marched into Stockholm, I remember, and I said, oh, I know what you need to do here in Sweden. You need to invest in R&D. You need to invest in universities. You need to generate patents. You need to generate research at the universities and so on. Human capital, beef up the education system. And our host that day, the minister, a very kind host, he said, well, that's all nice and well, Professor, he goes, but the audience will never really believe this, because by any international measure, could be R&D, R&D per GDP dollar, could be patents per capita, could be the quality of the education could be the any measure, science, engineering. Sweden ranked number 1 or number 2 in the world. And he goes, we're doing everything possible. And now you come in and say, but we need to invest more. And that was the first day I heard the Swedish paradox. And the paradox was that they seemed to be doing everything that the smart economists, the policy proponents said, which is if we shifted from, now we call it the second to the third industrial era, back then it's more knowledge matters, the R matters, not the K. But just to say you have to pump in more R, Sweden was doing great. So the paradox was they were doing the R, investing in the universities, investing in R&D, investing great schools. I remember too, I said, yeah, maybe what you need is more cultural investment so that people can get more creativity to come up with innovations. And if you can imagine the audacity of somebody from our side of the Atlantic going over to the old world and saying, you need more culture. Yeah, I was young. But that was the first day I heard this phrase, the Swedish paradox. And the paradox was, no, they're doing everything that Romer and this model advocated, but they weren't getting the growth on the left-hand side of the model. And the problem was the Romer and his model assumed that the R, these not when people get ideas, company gets ideas, they automatically become commercialized. They automatically end up in innovations. They automatically, we call it spillover, so that other firms and people can use them. But in fact, what was happening was they were banging up against what scholars call the knowledge filter. And the filter was, Prodi himself, the president of the EU, said, he asked, why have European countries rich in knowledge like Sweden, high R&D and high patents, exhibited such low growth rates? Well, it wasn't just Sweden that suffered from this knowledge filter. A senator, U.S. senator, actually from Indiana, Baugh, from Indiana University, way back in 1978, he complained, he said, a wealth of scientific talent at American universities and colleges, talent responsible for the development of numerous innovative scientific breakthroughs each year is going to waste as a result of bureaucratic red tape and illogical government regulations. He then goes on to ask, what sense does it make to spend billions of dollars each year on government-supported research and then prevent new developments from benefiting the American people because of dumb bureaucratic red tape? Well, I'm sure nobody here in the room is in favor of dumb bureaucratic red tape, but what he was observing was that when universities got grants from the Department of Defense, from the Pentagon, from the National Science Foundation, from the Environmental Protection Agency, they did research, and then people got ideas that this could result in innovation, this could result possibly in a new firm. They had to negotiate with the agency that had given the money, and this was the red tape. As a result of Baugh's concern, the U.S. Senate passed what's called the Baugh-Dole, with Robert Dole, the Baugh-Dole Act. This gave the property rights of the intellectual property to the universities, eliminated the red tape, and we had a flood of innovations coming out of universities. But the point is, it was this blockage was really serving as this knowledge filter. So knowledge is different from, the R in that equation of Romer is different from the K. If you've got a factory machine, you know what it can do, it can produce a product, but ideas are different. It's hard to know if an idea if it's valuable or not. You don't know if it's a new idea. You don't really know if it's a good idea or not. Let me be more specific. When there were 5 young men in Baden-Württemberg in Germany, and they were working for IBM. They came up with an invention, an idea that said, instead of just producing mainframe computers, IBM should produce a new business software, and this would make a lot of money for IBM. Makes sense. I mean, IBM had invested a lot of money in these young men, 5 of them. They'd had a lot of experience, a lot of training. They were part of R&D. So they do what they're meant to do. They come up with a new idea. That's what R&D does. The problem is when they went to their boss and their boss's boss, they had to figure out, is this idea a really good idea or not? And they thought about it and they said, this isn't what we do at IBM. We make mainframe computers. They say there's, people are going to buy this business software. Who's going to buy it? We don't think so. So they told the 5 young men, get back to work. Why don't you do something that we can benefit from? Well, the 5 young men, so basically the idea was it's uncertain because nobody knows what impact it's going to have. It's asymmetric because what the boss and the boss thought was a bad idea, the 5 young men thought was a good idea. And it's got these high transactions costs. I'm sure they tried to explain it and explain it. Still, the boss and the boss's boss thought, you know what, we don't see it. If it were simple, like how do I get to the student union, you could explain it to me, I would know I'd go. But when you're talking about innovations, nobody knows if it's a good idea or not. Is it going to work? Isn't it going to work or not? So what the 5 young men ended up doing was they thought, okay, they'll try to leave IBM, they'll try to commercialize this through another company with, say, Siemens or with BASF, another company. None of them wanted to touch it. So then they think, okay, we'll start our own company. So they go to the 3 main banks of Germany, the Deutsche Bank, the Dresdner Bank, the Commerzbank. The banks think it's kind of interesting, but they say, if this idea were any good, IBM would be doing it, so it must not be good. So that didn't work. Finally, they get some startup seed money from a family bank where they lived near Heidelberg, Germany, in Baden-Württemberg. They started SAP, and the rest is history. It's the one company in Europe that's grown to be a big global company. So, the idea hit this knowledge filter in IBM. Why did it hit this knowledge filter? It's because the ideas are uncertain, so that the decision-making hierarchy of the organization had a hard time agreeing on the value of the idea that the 5 young men thought was it. Now, it doesn't mean every entrepreneurial idea is good. It just means in this example, we could see it was good. In fact, we know most of the ideas aren't good. So I call this, or we could call this, endogenous entrepreneurship. What does that mean, endogenous? It says the firm isn't just there and then says, okay, how do I innovate? The firm is created because the people with the ideas, in this case the 5 young men, they had an idea that hit this knowledge filter in the context of the organization, IBM. They weren't able to do what they wanted to do. They were passionate about it, so they create the new firm in an attempt to reach their dreams, to follow their passion. To what degree was it money? I don't know. I've read different accounts. I think they were just frustrated in their job. Boss wouldn't let them do what they wanted to do. Their boss's boss wouldn't let them do what they wanted to do. So finally they just started their new firm, and it worked out really, really great. We hear this story, case study, time and time and time again, where ideas that are created in the context of one organization, they're actually not pursued in that context. Why is it that you think, well, doesn't the boss's boss, the decision-making hierarchy want to make money? Of course they do. But there was a famous song back when I was a student, some of you faculty remember, by Kenny Rogers with this chorus. You got to know when to hold them and know when to throw them, right? And the trouble is, how do you know when to hold them and when to throw them? And with the uncertainty, the asymmetries, and the high cost of transactions, it's not trivial. It's not trivial at all. That's what I think why entrepreneurship starts becoming important in the developed countries as knowledge, meaning people with ideas, becomes more and more important as we move away from the K, physical capital in the solar world, and move towards a world where ideas matter. But which ideas? And that tension, how to separate the good ideas from maybe the not such good ideas, that's why entrepreneurship starts to emerge as being important, so that the knowledge spillover theory of entrepreneurship posits that as we go into a context where ideas matter, we'd expect to see entrepreneurship matter by the inherent nature of ideas. Nobody's sure which is the good idea, the bad idea. It's the individuals who are, you could say, bold enough or feel passionate enough, are not just willing to say, okay, I'll forget it and I'll go back to, no, they want to see what's going to happen with their idea, and they or people they know start the new company. So the knowledge spillover theory of entrepreneurship says, first of all, as we move into a more society or economy where ideas matter, we'll see more entrepreneurship. But secondly, this entrepreneurship is key because Paul Romer, in his growth model that won him the Nobel Prize, he assumed in the model that investments in knowledge and research and development automatically spill over from, say, the university where it's created or the company that does the R&D, and that other companies or individuals can use that knowledge. But because of that knowledge filter, it doesn't automatically spill over. It takes somebody to say, hey, I think this is a good idea. Nobody's using it. The entrepreneur serves as the conduit for the knowledge, for the spillover of knowledge from the organization that created that knowledge, say in my example, it was IBM, to the organization that actually innovates. It's a new company, SAP. The entrepreneurship is important because without it, the knowledge won't spill over. I don't know if you young people still, movie's gotten kind of old, The Social Network, about Mark Zuckerberg and Facebook, right? And if you think about where was that idea for Facebook, where did it really come from? Where did it start, right? Well, it's great, it started at a university. And it wasn't really from research and development. I mean, you had some smart kids, I guess in a dorm, whether it was Zuckerberg or those twins, that's what the movie's all about. But notice there was an idea, but Harvard wasn't going to take that idea and turn it into an innovation. First of all, universities, we're not in that business. We educate students, we do research, we don't innovate. But they didn't even think it was valuable because of the uncertainty of the knowledge. My favorite scene of the movie was when the twins go to the president of Harvard University, Larry Summers. That was really notable because Larry Summers is the most prominent economist of my generation. He was, before he was president of Harvard, right? He was chief economist at the World Bank, and he was secretary of the Treasury, and then he became president of Harvard. So the twins, I don't know if you remember the scene, they go to the president of Harvard and they say, President Summers, Mark stole our idea. And I don't know if you remember his response. He said, boys, this is Harvard, get another one. Not recognizing this is like a once in a generation, once in 5 generation idea, and you just don't get another one. Well, it's hard to recognize new ideas. It was actually the spillover of the knowledge out of the organization where it was created, the university. Zuckerberg couldn't do it at that university. So he actually had to leave, had a hard time getting finance. You have to watch the whole movie, but we know he does get finance. He has to move to California, which is an interesting part. But that's the spillover. That's why it's knowledge spillover entrepreneurship. Without that entrepreneurship, I don't want to say we wouldn't have Facebook, but we wouldn't have the Facebook we have now. It would have come from some other place. Why is this view interesting and important? A lot of the theories of innovation, they say, oh, we've got firms, and then the firms are going to try to innovate to have a better performance. I think that's true, but this view says entrepreneurship's important because it's an endogenous response. It's a response to people having ideas, seeing opportunities. They're frustrated in the context they're in, the organizational context, just like Zuckerberg at Harvard. I mean, you could say, yeah, sure, of course, you can't sell this stuff at a university. That's not what we do. So we had to take it outside. Just like my IBM story with SAP. Well, there they could have commercialized the product, but they didn't think it was valuable. So the 5 engineers had to create their own firm. The entrepreneurship is the conduit for the spillover of knowledge. And places, meaning cities, regions, states, countries know this. And they start to realize, just like Romano Prodi, the head of the EU, if we can harness entrepreneurship, we're going to take our expensive, costly investments in knowledge. I mean, this university, it's a lot of money goes into this university, lots of tuition dollars by parents like me, but also lots of research dollars, tax dollars are coming, all kinds of funding to produce ideas. Some of it's in the form of students, some of it's in the form of research, lots and lots of ideas. And then as Senator Birch-Bayh was observing, and then if it just sits there, it's a waste. It's a real concern all around the world. All this expensive investment, and it just sits there. Well, entrepreneurship is not the only conduit, but it's a mechanism that says, don't let it sit there. When people have ideas, let's help them get it out into the market, create companies that otherwise wouldn't exist. So the focus now of lots of policy in lots of places all around the world is how do we harness this entrepreneurship in what's called entrepreneurial ecosystems? How do we create an environment that's conducive to entrepreneurship? Now, Gordon Moore, who founded the Semiconductor Intel, he said, it's simple. Combine liberal amounts of technology, entrepreneurs, capital, and sunshine. At a university, stir vigorously. Maybe, but what I learned when I was in your seats, when I was in college and then in graduate school, had nothing to do with entrepreneurship. It was about factors of production and resources, physical capital being one of them. And I'm not going to go through this too much. I don't know to what degree you've had economics, but yes, you see Solo's physical capital. Before him, natural resources mattered, unskilled labor, skilled labor, human capital, creativity. Then there's Paul Romer knowledge. All these are different types of ingredients, or you could say factors. Which is the right factor for the right place? I don't know. They could all be important. But Michael Porter, an economist at Harvard University, kind of took a departure from that and said, it's not just the amount of these ingredients you put in to producing things, it's what you do with them. If you think about a basketball team, it's not just about the talent you have, that matters, but then you got to figure out how to get which players on the court at the right time so that they play together well. And he argued that having these companies in clusters, where you've got firms working on similar types of activity, they're complementary, they're related, you get a bigger bang for your buck. Other thought leaders suggested it's having an economy that's specialized in something. Certainly Detroit was specialized in autos, there's no doubt about it. Pittsburgh was specialized in steel, no doubt about it. You could argue Orlando used to be specialized in entertainment. How about Las Vegas, right? You know, what happens in Vegas stays in Vegas. It's, I'm not sure what you want to call that, gambling probably, right? Specialized seem to work real well. But we know it works until it doesn't work. It's what happened in Detroit, happened in Pittsburgh. Other thought leaders say, no, you need the opposite, diversity or market power, have a big company. Or competition, have a lot of companies competing, and this is the way to get more ideas. So there's this element that's very different from the amount of ingredients. It says how it's configured at a place makes a difference. And then is the view that says, it comes from a woman named professor at the University of California at Berkeley. She's now the dean of the informatics school. She wrote a book called Regional Advantage, where she compares two places, Silicon Valley with Boston, and asks, why does Silicon Valley do better year after year than Boston, even though they both have the same ingredients, they both have the same factors and resources. They both have great universities, they have great scientists, great engineers, great human capital, all looks the same, and yet the growth, the innovation is stronger in Silicon Valley than it is in Boston. And our answer is culture, that there's a different culture, and what that culture is people are more networked, they're more linked, they have more interactions, and these networks are conducive to knowledge spillovers, where she kind of suggests and finds evidence that people are more isolated in Boston. So this leads to the framework that's discussed and described in the book that was kindly mentioned in the introduction for the strategic management of places. And there's a field in business goals called strategy, right? That is all about the strategic management of organizations. Could be for-profit organizations, could be for nonprofit organizations, but the focus is what should the leaders do, the decision makers of the organization do to enhance the performance, to try to get a competitive advantage that's sustainable over time. This is different because places aren't organizations. Waco is a place, right? I don't know what county we're in or what region we're in, but we're in a region here. That's a place. Texas is a place, a bigger place for sure. But the governor of Texas has a mandate, and I suppose the legislature as well, and a lot of the leaders, some of the companies, some of the nonprofits, the universities, to try to make Texas better, basically, how to make it wealthier, enhance the standard of living. And we say yes. What I learned in school, in college and graduate school is still relevant. Factors matter for sure, factors and resources. There's the physical capital, the human capital, the skilled labor, and so on. The spatial structure and organizational structure, that matters. There's a lot more dimensions. These are just examples here. And then we get, which I went through quickly, this human dimension that says something about institutions and culture at a place make a difference. This is just fleshed out. I'm not really trying to sell the book, but it takes more than just one talk to. In fact, I teach a class, a whole semester class on the book. The students use it for the book, and I kind of go through it all in the semester. I didn't teach it today because I was here, which I'm sure made my students very happy. And yet I still seem to be talking about it down here in Texas as well. And those are the underlying forces that drive policies, or that drive performance. So if you ask, like Annalise Saxenian, why does Silicon Valley perform better than Boston? Her answer is in the human dimension. She says, oh, it's networks and linkages. I don't want to argue if she's right or wrong. I can see she's pointing to that. The implication would be that if other places implement policies, and that's the policy part that says, okay, if we understand there's that link between that one element of networks, of human dimension, networks and linkages, the performance is going to be better at the place, then policy should try to figure out instruments that are conducive to networks and linkages. I would say the challenge is that's not the only thing that matters for why some place, in fact, maybe it's there's more creative people in one place. Maybe it's the infrastructure. There's a lot of elements here, but this is roughly a framework that matters. Entrepreneurship, of course, is crucial, but as the enthusiasm of policymakers to implement entrepreneurial ecosystems is kind of the newest fad right now for mayors of cities, for governors, for city councils. I'm not against that. The introduction said, yeah, I've spent my life doing research of entrepreneurship. But I think that places have to remember entrepreneurship's important, but it's not the only thing that's important. There's a lot of different plays in the playbook that can shape performance. So the challenge for policy is to figure out, given a certain place, given its history, given its context, where should the focus be to generate performance? Anyway, thanks very much.
So we have time for question and answer. So if you have a question, I can come around with the mic on this side, or you can come up there. Just raise your hand.
You know, you remind me of not a tennis coach. I took lessons of tennis millions of years ago, and I remember that instructor just said, just visualize hitting the ball over the net, and if you believe it, it'll go over the net. That never worked, actually. But that sense that says people, and I think where this enters in, because I think one thing for sure, your point is really valid. That you called it momentum, maybe some of the economists could call it expectations, but in a way, decision makers. I mean, you students, you're all thinking about when's the lecture going to end? No, you're all thinking about, after you graduate, where are you going to go? How many of you are planning to stay here in Waco, of the students? That's what I knew that, because I asked the same thing of my students in Bloomington in the class, and there's more of them, like 70, but the class looks about this size too, because they don't come. And I asked, how many of you plan on living in Bloomington when you graduate? Nobody's, it doesn't say where you're going to go. I mean, I would guess you're all going to move to Bloomington, right? No. You're going to go to Dallas, you're going to go to Houston, you're going to go to New York, you're going to go to Singapore, you're going to go to Vancouver, because you've got something in your mind. This is where it's not just success, but as you're all part of either human capital, or you will be if you pass your courses and get your degree. You're part of human capital or part of this creative class. But your ability to use that asset is conditional on where you go. So I don't want to say if you stay in Waco or Bloomington, but as individuals, we're making decisions. And so, in a way, what the question is talking about, is there this kind of, what do we call it, not vicious circle, but virtuous cycle, right? Where the strong get stronger. And I think there's that element for sure, because now it's also true that feeds into this, what I call either the human dimension, or really it's behavior in institutions. Places have identities and images. And it's amazing in my lifetime, you mentioned Austin. When I was in your seats in college and graduate school, Austin, it was just another Texas town. If I think about Durham, Raleigh, what's now the Research Triangle, it's a big, hot area. If I think about Portland or Seattle, Seattle was just a sleepy town up in, nobody talked about it. These places have changed their image, partly through success, but partly through a lot of kind of careful investments. Austin, anybody know the motto of Austin? Nobody knows the motto of Austin? I asked this in my class on Monday, and students knew it. They know it even in Bloomington, right? Keep Austin weird. Where does this come from? You could say, it's just marketing. Well, that's a kind of image that says Austin, compared to Waco, is edgy. It's creative. Now, I don't know if it is, but there's a lot of things that places do that can change the image. And then that will influence decisions of individuals, especially in those key groups, the creative class, the human capital, but also companies will want to go there. Entrepreneurs will want to go there. I think it's fascinating because you're right. You get this virtuous circle, and at what point does it turn into a bubble and start to self-destruct? I think we've seen some places do that for sure. People keep waiting for Silicon Valley to kind of burst as a bubble because it's so expensive, it's so congested. All this kind of hurts the quality of life, which starts to weigh down on the identity and image. But still, it's a great destination. And I think that for young people, I'm not talking about people in this room necessarily, I think that what they feel is that when they tell their friends, their parents, their relatives, oh, when I graduate, I'm going to go to Waco, people go, huh? Waco's a great place, like Bloomington. If you say, oh, I'm going to go to, what's that place in Michigan that had the polluted water? Flint. Oh, yeah, Flint. I'm going to go to Flint, Michigan. Your friends would go, why are you going to do that? No, it sounds a lot better to say, I'm going to go to Seattle. That's a hop. I'm going to go to Portland. I'm going to go to, I'm going to go to Miami. and that identity and image is, I think, I'm fascinated by that for sure. So you're right, places get momentum, and then the interesting challenge for the strategic management of the place says, well, if you're not one of those hot places, how can you become one? But we've seen places, place after place after place. If you think about globally, it would be Berlin. I used to live in Berlin, Germany. The reason I lived there, it was such a down and out place. After the wall was up, after the Nazis, the Holocaust, it was just, so they actually subsidized academics to go there and do research and so on. Now it's a big, trendy place. It didn't just change its identity and image, but it clearly did a lot of things to go from one of the most down and out places to having a pretty strong performance. Same thing with North Carolina, same thing with Austin. So it's a great question. I mean, there's no formula for it. But I think when you're at a place that's not one of the, as you said, kind of in this virtuous circle, in a way it says somebody's got to make an effort to help that place move ahead. That gets again to the human dimension, whether it's leadership, social capital. It's not a given though, that's for sure.
Thank you. Towards the end of your talk, you mentioned that there's a lot of mayors and local governments that are interested in pursuing entrepreneurship to be able to do what you're talking about. But you said that that might be misguided at some points. What are some suggestions besides entrepreneurship and besides this rebranding that you're talking about that you see maybe some examples of that?
Yep. Ultimately, I mean, I think I understand why entrepreneurship does make sense for probably most places. Is it an automatic? Is it a formula? Is it an algorithm? And I think the answer is no, because I think that if just looking at this, if the physical if the infrastructure, for example, is really in disrepair, and there's possibly no airport, no way to get there, if the roads are not, if you've got kind of safety issues and so on, a place can try to create an entrepreneurial ecosystem, but it's still going to have trouble attracting the entrepreneurs. There's a lot of other things to worry about besides. If you look at it may be that the education isn't what it could be or should be. So I think that, that's not necessarily going to overcome a bad infrastructure. You could try to have entrepreneurship. I think though, as those other elements become reasonable, entrepreneurship is really a focus because it gives the places, as I said, it's the conduit where people take ideas that are there, knowledge has been created, but just sitting there, they're the ones who get it out. The other thing is they tend to stay local, not always. Whereas a lot of the companies, they're more global, the existing companies, and so they may take the ideas, but they're not going to do it there. I know in Germany, where we used to work, there was a Fraunhofer Institute in Bavaria, and they're the ones who invented what's really the MP3 player, and they were very proud of this. It was commercialized in Japan, and that's where all the products came from. So they were really proud. The trouble is nobody took the idea until some Japanese company did. Had an entrepreneur done it, they probably would have been local, just like my SAP. It was not just SAP. Most entrepreneurship tends to be local. I kind of skipped over that part because I do know you have a life other than to listen to me, especially when the company's new. Now, as the companies grow and globalize, I mean, SAP, for example, is all over the world now. So you wouldn't want to say all that employment that's created is in Baden-Württemberg or Heidelberg. But in the earlier stages, they tend to be. And that's, I think, another reason why the policy, funny you ask, so why wouldn't the policymakers like entrepreneurship? And I'm saying, but they do like entrepreneurship and it's good because it tends to be localized, the benefits. And that's what they want. Yep, Peter.
David, when you and I were teenagers, hanging out on Friday night or Saturday night meant getting in your car, or getting in your friend's car, and going to the local restaurant or pizza place or the bowling alley or wherever the hangout spot was. you know, when I look at my own teenagers, sometimes hanging out with friends means putting on a headset and getting in front of the Xbox and doing a group, you know, Call of Duty kind of
Yeah.
battle or whatever. I wonder if you could talk about how the concept of place has maybe changed over the last 10, 20 years because of the internet and other kinds of communication. Also, you know, it used to be that if you lived in a town like Waco or a town like Bloomington, you know, you weren't going to have a good bookstore. The grocery stores would not carry all the exotic items that you could get in a big city. You couldn't get to see certain movies. Of course, now, thanks to Amazon and Netflix and whatever, yeah, of course, there are obviously still some things you can't do. You can't do outside of New York City or LA or Chicago. But the cost of living in a non, you know, Austin or whatever have really gone down because of technology. Does that mean that we need to change our thinking about, you know, what a place is and how important it is to attract people to some specific geographic spot?
I think that's great. It kind of couples with your question before. In some ways, you know, the rich get richer in terms of the Silicon Valleys and the Seattles and the Austins. It seems like, you know, that was your point about the, and so what can the rest of the geography, you know, most places are not Austin, they're not Seattle, they're not Portland. And, you know, Peter, your question is, but it seems like with the technology, there are big advantages that didn't used to be there. You know, when I look at this, I think, yeah, so how can those places try to get the key ingredients or factors and resources? Everybody, there's a consensus, human capital, creative class, and knowledge didn't quite make it because I had to fit on there. You know, you look at a small community like this or Bloomington, I mean, great universities, and yet the human capital wants to leave. I think that the answer in some ways is what I'm fascinated by this box of the mall. I think we understand the top box real well. That comes more from economics. This comes more from sociology, in particular, the discipline. I don't know where this comes from, but it matters. And it's that human perception that says, I want to go here. I think this is better. I think that somehow I'll be happy in this place. And I do think that there's so many places that have changed the way that the rest of the world thinks about them and it perceives them, changed the image as well as the identity of the people who are in place. I mean, whether you think about Atlanta, right? When we were young, I mean, Atlanta was just another southern town, right? Everybody says, oh, it changed. You know this, right, Peter? They say it was the infrastructure, the airport, and air conditioning, right? Well, air conditioning's every place. They do have a good airport, but there's a lot of airports. I mean, that may have helped, but they also changed, or there was a change in the way people thought about Atlanta. It's a cosmopolitan place rather than a provincial place. Places can do a lot to work, and I think smaller towns can work on that as well. Whether you're talking about La Jolla in San Diego, outside of San Diego, or Madison, Wisconsin, where I went, is now a hotbed of high-tech, biotech, and software. It's done real well attracting human capital and creative class. They've got a great university. I'm really proud to be alumni. But there's a lot of great universities, including mine, University of Illinois, list goes on, that's not able to do that. That's not quite, I don't know what the formula is, but I think, again, it's looking at some of those other elements, but also not saying there's nothing we can do. I think there's so many examples of places that have been able to beat the odds, but it takes, you know, when I say policy, it doesn't mean necessarily government policy, but it does mean people, organizations, firms at the place, they engage in investments that are place specific, that are actually in their self-interest. They've got sunk costs to try to enhance whatever element they think can. It's a great question.
If there's no further questions, we can go ahead and formally end. And if you want to stick around and come and say hi. or get a book and have it signed. We have time for that. So, thanks everybody for coming.